Hello and good afternoon, everybody, for attending this Big Five Digital Festival. And I'd like to start by thanking Suhas from Wassell Properties for inviting us to this session today. My name is Steve Morris. I'm the RSCS's head of the FM sector, and I'm joined today by Paul Bagust. Paul and I will discuss standards and guidance produced by RSCS today, but importantly, we want to look at standard and guidance in a holistic approach, and not just to define them to specific sectors such as FM, which I know many of you today attending will be from. But we need to look at this potentially across a wider property and built environment sector. So we'll move on to that shortly. But before I do, I just want to remind everybody that we are setting time aside at the end of this, Paul and I speaking, for your questions. So as we go through the slides, please make some notes, and log some questions with us in the chat box area. Okay, so to move on. I suppose it would be rude of us not to or to assume that everybody understands who the RSCS is. The RSCS, or the Royal Institution of Chartered Surveyors, has a reputation of being the world's leading professional body that promotes and enforces standards in land, real estate, construction and infrastructure, and obviously within that comes the FM sector as well. And we're there as a regulatory body more than anything for firms and organisations, and very key to the heart of what we do is the production of standards and guidance, and hence the reason why today we're joined by Paul Bagust, the Global Director for Property Standards at RSCS. So moving on then, standards and guidance, a holistic future. And I suppose, like anything, we have to consider then why our standards are important and why these bullet points roll out. Standards are everywhere in our life. You know, we're used to standards in everything we do. So there's no reason why we shouldn't expect them to play a key role across the property and construction industry. They provide us with clarity across a life cycle. They also provide us with a common approach, and they provide us consistency between organisations. And that's particularly important when more than one organisation is working to one aim or to one good outcome. So having a standard or guidance to follow is critical to that good outcome. It also gives us a very good basis for a mutual understanding. And above all, that will help us avoid conflicts and disputes that do happen from time to time between two partners. So this will help to reduce this. And particularly for RSCS regulated firms and their members, it provides them with regulation, and that also then reduces the risk to the public that we serve. And importantly, a subject that we're going to go on to is going to be quite core to today's discussion with Paul, is it also forms the fundamentals of performance and performance measurement standards. So that gives us a really good time to bring Paul into the conversation. And Paul, to kick off with them, why do RSCS produce standards and guidance?
Yeah, it's a great question. And hi, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for having us here. And it's a great question to start with, and I think whilst we don't necessarily want to focus all of our thinking on the pandemic, it is a great context for why standards are important, I think, and professionals are critical, and assurance is critical, and I think understanding the role and need for professionals in times of crisis is it just emphasizes the point, you know, and it brings it's very crystal at the moment that we need professionals, and professionals work to standards, and standards require regulation, and that provides assurance to business, it provides assurance to government, it provides assurance to you know, society and consumers, and it's absolutely essential that professionals work to standards, and those standards are enforced and regulated, because it's really around trust, and it's around risk, and without those elements in our society and professionals who deliver, then unfortunately, we see poor service, we see poor outcomes, and therefore it's really about protecting consumers and the public interest. And RSCS at its heart is an organisation that has the public interest at its centre, and that's absolutely critical that we are there to protect the public and serve the public.
Great, thank you. Yeah, thanks, Paul. That's great. And as we can see there, there's been a number of standards that RSCS has recently produced, one of them being Procurement of FM, the Global Code of Practice, which I'll go on to next, but also Responsible Business and International Building Operations Standard, which, as I said, is going to be core to one of the subjects we're going to talk to today. So moving on, thank you for that, Paul. And as we then look at Procurement of FM, I mean, this is something that we've been working on some time. I've spoken certainly to this particular region on this topic in the past, and we're pleased to say that this code of practice has now been released for the global market. And as we can see from the logos on the bottom of the document on the left-hand side of the slide, that it's also supported by a number of bodies, and this is something that can be attained by not only by people who are already regulated firms or members of the RSCS, but also those of you that aren't members. If you contact us or go onto our website, this is something you could download. But what we've got to consider, Paul, is who should use the code of practice and who are we aiming at, particularly when we highlight the fact that we want people to consider this holistically.
Yeah, thank you, Steve. And at the heart of standards, and I think this is a really important point, and at the heart of what RSCS professionals do, and I would imagine everybody listening to this today, sits ethics and conduct, and ethics and those behaviours underpin everything we talk about in terms of what professionals do. So a lot of our standards are drawn from ethical behaviours. RSCS has very clear rules, and we're actually undergoing a revision to our code of conduct, but that's central to what we do. And then what we tend to do is create sector-specific content. And RSCS, as Steve said at the beginning, is an organisation that reflects the life cycle of the built environment. So we have professionals who work in construction, and we have people who work in land. We have valuers, and we have people who work in real estate, whether they be service providers, whether they be end users. So a lot of our guidance reflects that conversation in our approaching. We don't come at it as a single issue organisation. So when we look at a subject like procurement, we definitely look at what are the risks when procurement is done badly, what underpins good procurement, and how does it work in the FM sector. And FM is a sector that is worth billions of dollars globally, and it's a critical sector, and it needs to be done properly. But it's underpinned by the need for ethical behaviour on all parties. So our document here is really aimed at all parties. So it's about having clarity, it's about having transparency, it's about ethical performance, and I think that really underpins the document. It is a very simple, straightforward approach to how to manage a procurement process before, during, and after, to ensure that the outcomes are fair and reasonable and transparent and fair. And that really is just what underpins the document. It sounds very simple to say. I would imagine most of you listening would understand it's very difficult to do that. But we understand that when procurement is done badly or poorly, the sums and the risk are very high. So having some clear standards that just lay out a process that we think sets out what would be reasonable, transparent, fair, and mostly important, ethical, is a document that I think that's why we've seen such great support all around the world from organisations that say this would help us. This is a very clear, transparent process that we think we could follow that would be fair for all sides. And I think that's the critical bit, Steve.
Yeah, thank you, Paul. That's some great highlights there of why it should be used and who should use it, and particularly in that holistic theme. And coming from the sort of market perspective, particularly those in FM or commercial departments, and particularly some people who aren't FM professionals necessarily, examples that we've seen in recent times when we've spoke to organisations that are looking to adopt this. Now, when I say adopt, RSCS look at adoption sometimes in a formal process. But also, as I said earlier, you don't have to be a member of the RICS to use our standards, because you can use them in a best practice or good practice term. And an ideal way to apply this particular document is, yes, ideally, a client imposes it within the process of procurement, of that procurement exercise, but it can also be used at any level. A service provider can push it up to the client, and it really does give somebody a term of reference. In my experience, particularly across the Middle East in procurement, if we had this particular document, the time that I spent in the Middle East, it would have been a great aid for the client, the service provider, or the managing agents to provide a good outcome. And I think that's fundamental. So thank you for that, Paul. So that then really brings us on to something else, Paul, I know is close to your heart, and a very interesting topic, Paul, that I know you've come up with recently, the age of unreal estate. Could you elaborate on that for us, please?
Yeah, thank you, Stephen. And yeah, I think again, people listening on the call will recognise that real estate is going through a period of change. It has been going through a period of change for some time. The current situation has accelerated some of that change and some of the thinking, and it's causing organisations to look at what is the role of their property, what's the contribution that it makes, how do we measure its value, and how do we improve? And I think that those are really interesting conversations that we're all having in our respective organizations. And we've created what we call an RICS insight paper. It's on our website. We would absolutely love for you to go and take a look. Love to hear what you think about it. But essentially it looks at how real estate was viewed even, say 10 years ago, and how the change process accelerated through the use of technology, how data will accelerate it, but also, and I think that the critical bit is that the drivers, as we move into understanding value as opposed to cost, what do we mean by value, and identifying issues around sustainability, climate change, social impact, but then also talking about experience and the way people interact with real estate, and then how do we measure that? And I think we're going to talk about that in a minute, but it's that critical change in the role real estate plays, and again, to come back to the original point, the absolutely critical role that professionals will play in that, whether that be in terms of design and build, which is clearly central to how buildings perform, and in terms of how they operate and how they work, and how do we build that collaboration between sectors. Steve mentioned this holistic approach. How do we build this collaboration between those who are involved in construction, between those who are involved in FM, and those who are involved in actually operating the buildings? And I think those are sort of critical themes that we talk, and what's going to underpin that will be this changing expectation of what buildings do and how we measure that, and how we use technology and how we use data. So that's what this paper explores, and I think we're going to talk about that in a little more detail about how the RICS might look at that. But I think it's our view is that the COVID situation has absolutely accelerated a lot of organizational thinking about their real estate, and that's going to impact on their strategic thinking in terms of location strategy, etc. But it's a very sort of people-centric, data-centric approach. So again, very interested. Hope some questions come up later about thoughts on how we do that. How do we build that collaborative approach? How do we align construction and design with use? And I know, Steve, you've got some thoughts on that from your experience.
Yeah, yes, Paul. Yeah, and just slightly before we go on to that, you mentioned that the insight paper is available on the RICS website, and I believe at the end of 2019, yourself, others, and RICS released a report on this. So what's the next steps from the insight paper? Is this something we're likely to see a guidance on in the future for business?
I think the next steps. I mean, what the paper talks about is there's a couple of things we're going to do next, which we are going to talk about. One will be we're going to do some work on a specific, which is around the piece on responsible business, which is identified there on the slide there, the ESG piece and how that gets delivered in terms of service providers, and then a wider piece in terms of creating, a consistent global approach to how buildings are operated, managed, and measured. And I think that those will be the two things that we're going to drive. We've had a huge engagement with people all around the world. Again, anxious to hear what people think today, whether they be occupiers, designers, architects, facilities managers, that we do need more consistency in how buildings are operated, managed, and measured. So that's exactly what the next steps are in terms of taking that forward. So that's a big piece of work, obviously, but I think we're very enthusiastic, but we're also committed and aware that it's really necessary at the moment.
Thank you, Paul. Yeah, and you mentioned my experiences, and when I relate back to my time, in the markets, and particularly when we spoke about procurement earlier on, I mean, how things were procured and how sustainable was it, where to the economy, how things changed, the fact of trying to change different service providers, trying to roll over the terms too quickly of what were going on. The terms, I mean, they served on the contract, but the impact that we then had through procurement and through the strategy of procurement and the strategy of maintenance that has an impact, and how we all have responsibility of what we do within an organization and how that impacts then on the wider public. And I think I just saw so many aspects on that where I saw you got the vision where people were going, it's quite blinkered in their approach and not thinking the wider impact of our actions, basically. And I for one, is certainly hoping that this sort of content that RCS producing are really going to open up people's eyes to greater consideration, and particularly as we come out, hopefully, of this current situation, which I think nicely moves us on, because you mentioned the measurement and performance, because if you can have responsible business, you need something that performs well. And as something I know that's very close and dear to your heart, Paul, is the International Building Operations Standards, IBOS, Paul.
Yeah, that's great. I think you skipped over the responsible business one, but we'll come back to that one, shall we? So let's talk about the idea for an international building operations standard, and we'll refer to it as IBOS for the purposes of this. So, and I think it really just, as I said, follows on from the conversation we just had around the need, and again, it's a holistic approach. We will all benefit from having a consistent approach to operating buildings, whether you be an investor, an occupier, a service provider. And I think it's absolutely critical that we're able to create benchmarks, and the way we do that is through data and technology, I think, Steve. So I think we can move on, and I'll explain what we mean. So IBOS, great. IBOS is essentially a data-led international standard that will enable you to benchmark your buildings to a consistent level, and it's really all about sort of a people-centric approach to buildings that reflects the need for buildings to be sustainable and provide experience and performance. At the same time, it's critical that buildings are safe and they are cost effective. And we are talking about all buildings here. We're not just talking about offices. We're not just talking about new builds. We're talking about older buildings, and some of the things that I know everybody listening will understand is that all buildings would benefit from a consistent approach to understand what the user needs in that building and how it is aligned. And it's, we talked about strategic FM for many years, but how does the operation of the building support the organization's strategy? That's fundamental. So a school would have a different need than an office, but they would still have a need for their buildings to support what they do. And if we can skip on, Steve, we'll talk a little bit about how we've approached that. So in the insight paper, we've taken Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which is a sort of well understood sort of psychology of what people need to perform at their best. And you see they need everything from sort of food and nutrition all the way up to sort of other things at the top of the triangle. So we've tried to adopt that approach for how we operate a building. So the traditional approach, and one we're probably all familiar with, is buildings will be compliant, buildings will be functional, buildings will be cost, and we will manage the cost. Those are absolutely critical and remain critical, would never have been more critical, that the cleaning and the catering and all those costs, and the space is measured, and we understand how many people are in the building, but we have to reflect that as towards the top of the triangle there, what's the impact and how do we measure that in relation to the experience of the user? So if you clean the building, just simply measuring how often you clean it doesn't tell you, has that building had an impact on how people use the building? Do people feel safe? Do people enjoy the building? And therefore, are they productive in the space? And you can apply that to children who need buildings that provide them with good adequate lighting and good adequate heating in order for them to learn effectively, as much as you can do it in a warehouse or you can do it in an office. And it's just critical that you understand that holistic, complex nature to operating a building is central to its performance to align to the strategy. And that has to include sustainability and measuring waste and carbon, etc. So that's a complex amount of information that you need to capture. So we are trying to simplify it, because that's really important, that it's not about putting people off. It's about identifying those key pillars and saying there's data that you can capture within it that you can then measure and benchmark, and then you'll be able to understand where you are, what you're doing really well, where you might need to improve, and how you might be able to do that. So we will be looking to bring forward some drafts and share that with you for consultation and market insight, because that's important that we talk to everybody in the market. So it's all about an investor perspective and, an occupier perspective. And ultimately, this will start to have an impact on value. And it's a really important piece of work, but it's about consistency and data and standards that enable us to create buildings that are performing to the best as they can to support the strategy of the organization. And we've never needed something like this more, in my opinion. So that's essentially what IBOS is, again, really keen to hopefully hear some questions in the next 15 minutes.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. I think that's a great insight, and I think actually, you were right. I mean, I skipped past the responsible business, but in fact, when we think of this IBOS, this whole concept of IBOS, that's going to measure something, not just FM, not just the occupier, not just the public who may use that facility, but in that far wider holistic approach, taking all the pieces of pie. Maybe a good point. And I'll just jump back to the responsible business one, because I think it actually, IBOS does for me, jump out. That's something that cuts across responsibility. So let me just.
I agree, and again, I think something, and again, everyone listening to this will be familiar with lots of conversations that go on the UN Sustainable Development Goals. Everybody's talking about ESG. Everyone's talking about social value and social impact, and IBOS will look at how we might measure some of those. But I think also RICS is very anxious that for the sector that we are in, the built environment, which is a huge sector and has a huge impact on the environment and people's sort of social interaction. So and I think we understand that responsibility, and I think our firms, and that's one of the changes I alluded to at the top, is something that lots of firms are really looking at is actually what is their impact in our society? How do they make sure that we have a positive impact, and how do we change behaviors and how do we align? So we have the UN Sustainable Development Goals. So we have lots of information, and I think one of our key roles, Steve, is to bring clarity. And I think so. What we are trying to do is bring some clarity to some of the definitions, and then we will look at some of these areas around ESG and say, if you're working in the context of real estate, these are some things you can actually do. These are some practical things you can do in terms of sort of some leadership ambition, but how do you embed it and how do you support it in a real estate strategy? And that does align to IBOS, and I think it's much needed. And and RICS is very collaborative. We're really anxious to work, and we are working with lots of organizations globally, who may not traditionally be in the real estate sector. So there would be, the World Green Building Council. We talk to the UN a lot. We talk to national governments a lot, and lots of organizations around that. So we're very keen to have this sort of collaborative approach to build some clarity and consistency to enable organizations who are, I know they have this as a priority in terms of the environmental piece and how we add social value. So critical that we support that. That's what that piece of work does, and it does clearly align to the IBOS activity as well. But it's those are two, and those things haven't changed during the COVID situation. Organizations are still very, very aware of their responsibilities in terms of environmental performance and the need to measure and create spaces which are performing at the highest possible level. Those things have accelerated, not diminished.
Right, thanks, Paul. And I think another fantastic example that you're showing there, the fact that, these standards and guidance are all related. They all interact with each other, but particularly the fact that it's holistic across the built environment. It's not just a certain sector that needs to apply. And something I know you and I have spoke about internally, Paul, before, and to others, is that just because it doesn't say FM on the front, that doesn't mean it doesn't apply to you. Because I know from seeing the full portfolio of RICS documents, there are over 30 current documents, standards and guidance that certainly would have helped me in my previous life in the FM market, and that's for sure. So just moving back forward, so excuse all those who are listening today, excuse the clunky view of the slides as I go back to take us on to our concluding slide, actually, after the IBOS. And Paul, just to really get your final thoughts on the insight and where you want to go, and is there anything else you want to ask for people who are out there from companies, organizations, that they may volunteer to work for us?
No, absolutely. Thank you, Steve. I think that the themes that we've set out today are really the connectivity of our market is critical. So whether you consider yourself to be an FM or a cost consultant or an occupier, the connection and the relationship between us all is absolutely critical. So collaboration is key, I think, and I think we would all recognise that professionals play an absolutely vital role. They always have done. That's only going to get greater as we look to emerge from the current situation. We're going to need professionals, and professionals need to have standards. They're driven by their ethical behaviors, and they play an absolutely huge role in our society. And I think that the nature and the connectivity of what these professionals do and the services they provide, underpinned by standards, will be central as we look to evolve and develop. And I think the changing nature of the expectation of what professionals do, it all sounds very simple to articulate, that operating a building is simple, but actually it's an incredibly complicated and an incredibly valuable piece of work. So one of the things we want to do is articulate the value that our professionals provide in terms of the planet and in terms of people. And it's absolutely central that we have people driving productivity and recovery, and that, again, huge issues, but underpinned by professionals and underpinned by standards, and very, very keen for people to engage with the RICS. We can't create this stuff independently, so I think our details are available for people, feeding through the chat, or contact Steve or myself directly, and really interested to hear from you. Even if you disagree, very happy to hear that. It's always interesting to get any feedback. Challenge is always welcome, and we're really happy to have that debate and attend events and etc. and present. So thank you for the opportunity today.
Great, thank you, Paul. And I know, again, relating back, when I think about it, I'm very excited about this product, and mainly because when I think back to the amount of times, either when I was the client or when I was the service provider talking to the client, and they used to ask us about measurement, and the only thing we could really measure on was, what the rate per square foot or per meter was, or the sellable value or the rentable value, or how were we performing against our KPIs, against the service levels. But this is really something that is going to bring all elements and all sectors together in one method of performance, and that's why I'm excited. So thank you once again, Paul, for that, and for everybody listening. We look forward to your questions, and we'll move on to the question session next, I believe. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Steve Morris and Mr. Paul Bagust. That was a really very interesting discussion on the procurement strategies, the standards and the processes that to be followed, and also the concept of IBOS. That was really something enlightening and very good. Now we will go to the Q&A session as mentioned earlier. The first question we got is addressed for Mr. Paul. It's about IBOS. How much similar or dissimilar it is from the green building, and would a guideline be sufficient, or a local legislation is needed for enforcement of this concept on a larger scale?
Thank you. It's a very good question. And I think the concept of IBOS really is, so rather than focusing in the way BREEAM or other standards do on one specific aspect of a building, the concept of IBOS is that it brings together various pillars so sustainability, or the green building piece, is a pillar in IBOS, but we have to, when we look at the operation of space, we also have to address other issues. That's why we sort of talk of it as a holistic standard. So when we talk about the IBOS model, we will also look at the relationship that if you take the green building, okay, what's the relationship between cost and sustainability? If you want to retrofit a building, how does that impact on your function? How much space is good for a green building? How does it impact on compliance? So it's having that holistic view. So when we talk about cost, compliance, function, aligning to sustainability, aligning to experience, I think the IBOS model is taking some of that fantastic work that exists, and we're not trying to compete with that. We're trying to layer it, but it sort of almost sits over it in terms of the approach where it's saying, okay, the green building is part of this, but we have to understand the green building would have an impact on cost and experience and function. So how do you look at all of that in one go, and how do you use data, and how does that, how does technology enable you to do that? So it's a really important part of it, but it's not all of it, and that's the difference.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you very much. I think that's very clear. The next question is for Steve. How much the blockchain is expected to influence the process of procurement, and what is the likely impact of the smart contracts on the procurement strategies in future?
Thank you, Sue. I say that now. That's an interesting question. I must confess, I mean, my depth of knowledge of blockchain is not fantastic. But if we consider my understanding, obviously, a blockchain as a digital ledger, where there's accessible records that can be obviously, protected, so long as the people who are sort of managing a procurement process, then there's clear synergy with using blockchain right from the start, because at the end of the day, blockchain is providing that ledger that can record the costs submitted at a tender process. You can actually, I'd imagine somebody running procurement through blockchain as a protection of data and a sharing of data. You're actually cost schedules you can submit can be embedded in blockchain, so you can then take that forward and have that life cycle of it. I mean, the protection side of it, I'm sure, the people at blockchain have that in place as a matter of course, but, as long as the owners understand they can protect that data, for me, there's a clear opportunity to use a blockchain to record costs from all the different providers submitted, and then take that as a historical record until you finally have the people you award to. So, in short, at the end, yes, definitely a role to play as that develops.
Wonderful. That's, I think, a great insight, because the concept of blockchain itself is not very clear for many people, and it's still in the gray and evolving stages. So that can definitely add very value for the people to know about the blockchain and the concept of the smart contracts. Moving on to the next question. This is addressed for Paul. In the Maslow's pyramid, which is very interesting, by the way, for buildings, how many developers would practically stop at the economical needs, and where does the aesthetics fit in this pyramid?
Yeah, and that's a brilliant question. I mean, that's a fantastic question, and I think, isn't that one of the challenges that we have as an industry is how do we get developers and occupiers and facility managers to collaborate more closely on what buildings are there to do, and I think the COVID situation has accelerated this conversation rapidly, and yes, there will always be a focus on cost. But this is not what people want. This is not what investors are looking for, and this is not what occupiers need, and this is not what FMs are being asked to deliver. So we have to have conversations with developers to create and develop buildings that everybody wants, because the expectation is buildings will be different in the future, and they have to be different. And therefore, and no one is saying cost isn't absolutely critical, but again, the IBOS model is understanding that cost is critical, but then you have to look at the aesthetics, you have to look at the performance, and you have to look at the experience, and those things drive value, and value is the critical thing here. It's just not about cost, it's about value and being responsible in how we look at those issues. So there's always going to be different perspective. Working at RICS, we're tremendously fortunate because we have life cycle membership. We have a huge section for construction and development, and then we have another section for occupiers and management. So we do get to be part of the conversation, whether that's around BIM, whether it's just about sort of our life cycle cost standards. But I think it's the critical conversation as we move forward. It's a really difficult one, but I think it's one that's overdue us having as an industry to say, actually, we can't continue to build buildings without the occupier and the FMs being part of the conversation, because they won't be sustainable in the long term. And I think that's a real challenge for the profession. Don't have the answer. Would love to come back next year and let's talk about that in some more detail. But I think the iBoss idea is that we have better data, and we can ask better questions of developers, and we can show the value of those buildings. And I think that might help us as an industry a lot. But I think that's a fantastic question, whoever asked it.
Suhas, could I just add to that slightly, because it's something that's quite dear to my sort of thinking about FM, and it's this whole question about is when should FM be involved in the process. And I'm a great believer and advocator of involving FM right from the concept of design. And obviously Paul and I know more about it, certainly Paul, but as the markets here start to develop and roll out to iBoss, what we have here, we have a tool that design, from concept, you can design for iBoss, design to iBoss, because for me, it's something that actually will see an activity involving FM and the managers, not just FM, it's asset managers, property managers, it's a whole spectrum of people involved in the management of the asset, and architects, truly from the concept right the way through to the demolition. So it's a process that can use 100% through the life cycle of the asset, and that's fundamentally a bit of a game changer in my view.
Wonderful. I think these are also very valuable inputs. And now we move to the next question. What are the main differences of iBoss according to the ISO 41001 and ISO 55001?
Yeah, that's a great question. Normally at this point, I'd say my Wi-Fi was not working, but I'll try and answer it. So I think, if I'm honest, iBoss will be a very different piece of work. I mean, those are great standards. They're tremendous detail. iBoss is not that sort of standard. It's a data-led standard. It's a very high-level standard. I think we would reference those standards, and if people want to go into the detail that the ISO ones do, I think they're really valuable. ISO is much more around data, so I'm not sure they're really comparable in that sense. It would. iBoss will talk about what indicators you would need to capture in what are the pillars, so compliance, sustainability, experience, what would be the indicators and what would be the data, and then how do you self-assess and and how do you benchmark that information. It's a very different piece of work, I think. So we are definitely keen to collaborate and make standards consistent. I think where you have too many standards, it defeats the object. It's intended to be embracing of existing work, but I just think it's a different piece of work.
Wonderful. That's really great. In one of the earlier questions, when answering it, you mentioned about BIM technology. So now the BIM has become popular, though it has been in use for a long time and people had known about it, but the usage of the BIM has really picked up in the last few months or probably a couple of years. So how do you think the application of BIM technology, because it involves all the stakeholders, will help in implementing the iBoss?
Steve, do you want to answer that? Conscious.
Yeah, again, I mean, it's BIM. I mean, it's funny, this one, because when BIM first came along, everybody saw this as again another process tool for all. But we seem to see a bit of a falling off of the edge of the cliff top. When we come to the handing over from construction into management, and again, it goes back to, in some ways, is what's the role of FM from the start? And in many ways, again, I see a role of FM from the start is actually being the project managers of BIM through the construction process and then beyond. I mean, it's certainly something for Paul and his team and myself at RSCS to look at, well, how can BIM bring value to iBoss as well? And how is that another tool to give us that greater value to BIM? And we know, and RSS are talking to other people, is to do with open BIM, an FM in that BIM process. So it's going to be an interesting time ahead for us on this.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Mr. Steve and Mr. Paul, both. That was really very enlightening and very enriching session that we had with you. I'm sure that the attendees and the participants had great insights from this.